Looking at Cultural Differences, Part 2B, INTC 6523, Intercultural Communication. We have looked at various cultural orientations in the three previous videos, contrasting them with the predominant orientations of our Western culture. We have seen that some cultures are event-oriented more than time-oriented, relationship-oriented as opposed to task-oriented, high context as opposed to low context, holistic thinking as opposed to categorical thinking, differences in hospitality, group-oriented as opposed to individualistic, and a tendency to conceal vulnerability as opposed to exposing vulnerability. Now we will look at the contrast between guilt and shame-based cultures. Most of the cultures outside of the West are shame-based. 70% of the cultures in the world are considered shame-based cultures. And these shame-based cultures tend to be predominantly relationship-oriented, event-oriented, collectivist, high contacts, holistic thinking, non-crisis oriented, and with a tendency to conceal vulnerability. Dialogue. The scene. Mr. Coyle is reviewing Khalil's work evaluation. Why did Khalil apologize for disappointing Mr. Coyle? Do you think Mr. Coyle was aware of what he was communicating to Khalil? How could Mr. Coyle have handled the situation differently? And how does the differences between shame and guilt impact the way we communicate the gospel cross-culturally? Dialogue. Mr. Anderson is confronting Abdullah about an incident during a recent examination. In many Middle Eastern societies, honor is a paramount virtue, and shame, or the public loss of face, is accordingly the ultimate humiliation. Criticism, therefore, has to be handled with extreme delicacy, which is to say it is to be avoided whenever possible, and where that is not possible, it should be expressed with the utmost discretion and in direction. With his extreme sensitivity to the matter, Khalil naturally interprets the most fleeting and highly understated reference to a particular mistake or difficulty as criticism of the first order. Imagine then how he would interpret a direct statement of criticism such as that given here by Mr. Coyle. For his part, Mr. Coyle is in fact rather pleased with Khalil's performance, all in all, except in one or two areas where he thinks Khalil could improve. But to Khalil, such a blatant and direct statement of his deficiencies can only mean that Mr. Coyle is very disappointed. We must remember that Khalil naturally assumes Mr. Coyle is bending over backwards to be sensitive as possible to his honor. If that is true, and this is the best Mr. Coyle can do, if this represents the best face Mr. Coyle can put on the matter, then Khalil's performance must be very poor indeed. How then should Mr. Coyle have handled the matter? Mr. Coyle's proportions are off. He should have spent most of the interview lavishing exaggerated praise on Khalil, and then mentioned any shortcomings very briefly in passing at the end. Even then, Khalil would have taken the criticism serious, but his honor would have been preserved and he could have withstood the onslaught. And in the conversation with Abdullah, Abdullah was protecting Hussein's honor by allowing him to copy on the test. Because if Hussein failed the test, he would lose face, he would be shamed, and even Abdullah could be shamed because he had the opportunity to help Hussein and didn't. The differences between shame-based cultures and guilt-based cultures have a significant impact on the way we share the gospel cross-culturally. Shame-based cultures, according to Elmer, the pressures to conform to the norms of society are explicit and exerted from without. So there's pressure from without the individual to conform to the norms of society. In guilt-based cultures, there is an internalized sense of wrong, so that the one who feels guilty punishes himself or herself. Guilt-based cultures tend to be individualistic cultures. Shame-based cultures tend to be more group-oriented cultures. Guilt. When one violates a rule or a norm, this triggers a sense that one has done something wrong. The behavior and the person committing the behavior are viewed as separate. Shame. The key here is to protect the honor of oneself, one's family, one's clan, etc. If one does something to disappoint significant others in one's life, then shame occurs. The act and the person are not separated. So in guilt-based cultures, such as our culture here in America, we separate the behavior and the person committing that behavior. We often use the expression, hate the sin but love the sinner, because we see the sin and the sinner as being separate. In shame-based cultures, the act and the person are not separated. In shame-based cultures, when we criticize one's behavior or words, we are in essence criticizing the person. Therefore, face and honor are important. In shame-based cultures, people see things more holistically. Guilt-based cultures tend to be more categorical in their thinking. We criticize the behavior, but we don't see this as a criticism of the person himself or herself. In the Bible, Romans 3:19, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. In this passage, Paul is speaking to Gentile believers who understood the concept of guilt. In Romans 10:11, when addressing Israel and talking about Israel, Paul writes, for the scripture says, whoever believes on him will not be put to shame. And shame is mentioned several times in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 2:11. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers, in the midst of the congregation I will sing your praise. Then Hebrews 11:16. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. In Hebrews 12:2. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So we see that shame and guilt are both talked about in the Bible. Well, what causes shame? Well, according to Elmer, there's various ways that we can shame people. We shame people by blaming them, stating that someone is to blame for a specific matter. What to do to avoid this? Hold your tongue. Be slow to speak and quick to listen. Remember, shame-based culture people do take it personally. When we talk about people's shortcomings, never do this in the presence of others. Do it in private. But when you do, preface this with how much you value the relationship and want to preserve it. Start with praise before mentioning one's shortcomings. Remember the dialogue between Mr. Coyle and his co-worker, and Khalil, his subordinate. And Mr. Cole should have started with praise before mentioning Mr. Khalil's shortcomings. Don't compare. Don't compare your country with theirs, especially if it involves trying to show how your country is better. If you're asked to compare, praise their country first and be humble about your own country. But don't overdo the criticism of your own country. Refusals can cause shame. Direct refusals to a request can cause shame. Say something like, I would really like to help you out, but at that moment I'm not sure that it's possible. Perhaps if things change I will get back to you. This refusal idea can cause shame. Is seen simply in many cultures as asking for directions. If you ask someone, do you know how to get to such and such a place, they will not tell you no. They will not give you a direct refusal because that would cause shame. It would cause them to be shamed and it would cause you to lose face as well. The Eden effect. There were 3 specific effects to Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. Guilt. They knew that they had broken God's rule, God's law. Shame. They were ashamed because they were naked, so they went and hid themselves. Hid themselves because they were in fear. So the 3 specific effects to Adam and Eve's sin in the garden: guilt, shame, and fear. Guilt. The knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve had this. The knowledge of right and wrong through our conscious internalized sense of wrong, so that one who feels guilty punishes himself. Adam and Eve, when they ate of the fruit, knew that what the difference was between right and wrong. They knew that they had done something wrong before God. Shame, bringing dishonor upon oneself or another. Norms of the society are explicit and exerted from without. Incorporates the basic anxiety and shapes the guilt through the promises of acceptance or threats of rejection. So shame is exerted from without. Adam and Eve had shame in the garden. They hid themselves because they were naked. And then fear. People see themselves as living in a physical world that coexists and is influenced by unseen powers. People fear other people, especially those outside of their group. They fear the supernatural. Adam and Eve feared God, so they hid themselves after they ate of the fruit. So these 3 were the effects of Eden and the fall. Guilt-based culture. No guilt is forgotten so long as the conscience still knows of it. Guilt-based culture. Right versus wrong is the yardstick we use in U.S. culture with which to measure everything else. Reflect for a moment. You're in the swimming pool. The lifeguard blows his whistle. Everyone looks to see who is blowing his whistle, who he's blowing his whistle at, who is guilty. When we realize he's not blowing his whistle at us, we resume swimming. The Roman road is often the tool used to share the gospel in guilt-based cultures. Most guilt-based culture approaches to sharing the gospel usually start in Romans 3. And then there is this sign in Canada, in a mosque in Canada, that says we accept everyone and tell no one he is a sinner. It was at the Roman Empire that developed a complex legal system that required lawmakers, lawyers, and judges. Roman law had an impact on Christian theology in the West. Roman law interpreted everything in terms of right versus wrong. It's interesting that Eastern Orthodox theology did not deal directly with the issue of sin, guilt, and redemption. They dealt more with the issue of our standing in the presence of God or not, whether we were far from God or close to God, and our relationship with God and with others. A story from Roland Mueller in his book Honor and Shame. The missionary's taxi screeched to a halt. Lying in the middle of the road was a teenage girl, dying. She had been shot in the head 4 times. Just then her brother walked across the street with 2 policemen and stated, "There she is. I killed her because she was in an immoral situation with a man." Under the laws of the country, the young man was innocent. He had not committed murder, but had preserved the honor of his family. A second story by Roland Mueller. In another case, a girl ran away from home. Later, her family learned she had married someone from another religion. They were furious. The police imprisoned the girl so that she would be protected from her family. Elderly grandmothers taunted the brother and father. How long do we need to keep our heads to the ground in shame? Won't you do something to cleanse the shame from our tribe so we can raise our heads and live in honor once again? The family agreed to pay the police $50,000 as a guarantee that they would not hurt her, and she was released into their custody. Within hours, her father and brother shot her 13 times. The entire family was pleased that honor had been restored. Fear-based culture. In fear-based cultures, many people in the world today live their lives revolving around interaction with the spiritual world. This is true of many tribal religions, many folk religions, animist. They view the universe as a place filled with gods, demons, spirits, and ancestors. They seek to live in peace with its powers, and their lives are full of fear. So they either have to appease these powers or overcome them. They fear the supernatural and they fear each other. So power becomes an important concept in fear-based cultures. Shame-based culture. The underlying principle is that there are honorable and dishonorable ways of doing things. In Arab culture, when you visit your friends, you honor them in the way you act. They honor you in the way that they act. For example, 3 cups of coffee bestows honor on you. The first cup is called salam, or peace. The second cup is called sadaqwa, or friendship. The third cup is called isaf, the sword. The meaning is clear. When you arrive, you may be offered a cup of coffee that represents peace, you and your Arab friend. As you eat and drink, a second cup is offered. The last cup, the sword, illustrates her willingness to protect you and stand by you. It makes no difference if you are right or wrong. They are bound by their honor to protect you. In shame-based cultures, shame and or fear of shame are used as controlling forces in people's lives. Shameful deeds are covered up, and if they cannot be covered up, they are revenged. In some Eastern cultures, if shame cannot be hidden, the way out is suicide. In order for shame-based cultures to work, shame and honor are usually attached to something greater than the individual. Honor is almost always placed on a group. In Western culture, telling the truth is right and telling lies is wrong. But in shame-based cultures, the question is what is being said honorable? If a lie protects the honor of a family or a clan or a tribe, then it's fine. Go ahead and lie. But if a lie is told for selfish reasons, then it is shameful. So we want to ask the question, is what is being said honorable? It's not whether it's right or wrong, truth or a lie. Is what is being said honorable? Does it protect the honor of a family, a clan, or a tribe? In shame-based cultures, rather than encourage others, people criticize and question others. This is seen as positive as it keeps people from being proud. So there is the intentionality to shame people because this is seen as positive and it keeps people from being proud. So there's a sense, now you don't shame in public because you cause people to lose face, but shaming is a very strong motivator and it keeps people from being proud. So for example, in Chinese society, you will often hear when someone praises a Chinese mother or father's child that the mother and father will deny the praise and play it down because they don't want their child to become proud. Shame, face, and honor. Minji. The Thai word for losing face means to tear or rip someone's face off so that they appear ugly before their friends and community. In many cultures, people do not differentiate between criticism of an idea and criticism of a person. To criticize one's thought is to criticize the person, and that causes loss of face. In many cultures, if you cause a person shame, you also shame the entire family or group depending on the status of that person and his or her network of relationships. Honor and shame in the Bible. The Bible begins with humankind's fall into shame and ends with humankind being anointed with the glory and honor at God's right hand. There are 190 references to honor in the Bible, 100 plus references to shame. Guilt is mentioned only 40 times and only 7 times in the New Testament. So let's look at Leviticus 26:13. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. God allows his people to fall into slavery in Egypt to demonstrate to all the shame-based nations in the Middle East the power of God in raising his people from a position of shame to one of honor among the nations. Hear it again. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. There are various word pictures in the Bible about honor and shame and about the process of what God did through us through Jesus Christ. God brought us from being defiled to a state of being cleansed before him. God moved us from being naked to being clothed. He moved us from a position of weakness to a position of strength. Salvation is seen as being taken from sickness to be healed. Other word pictures in the Bible, God, through Jesus Christ, took us from a place of being far from God to having God's Spirit dwelling inside of us. Took us from being cursed to being blessed. Took us from being spiritually poor to having riches in God. God took us from being blind to seeing, and yes, he even took us from being guilty to being redeemed. How honor is gained. Honor is gained through honoring elders, hospitality, education, marriage, your heritage, your ancestors, your family line, how wise you are, how much money you have, how much charisma you can have, what kind of physical strength you exhibit, alliances that you can make, acts of bravery, acts of loyalty, even acts of violence can gain honor, and acts of service. The causes of shame, as we looked at earlier from Elmer, blaming someone, pointing out their shortcomings, suggesting someone has made an error, asking for something that is too difficult or too costly to do, saying no to a request someone makes of you directly. Elmer gives us some suggestions of sharing the gospel in shame-based cultures. He says, share your story. Put yourself in the position of shame. Don't tell someone he or she is a sinner. Use collective language. For example, everyone stands in need of a Savior. Explain that Adam and Eve caused God to feel shame, so all of us have caused God shame by not obeying his commands. Share with them that the ultimate shame is putting trust in the wrong place. If we put our trust in Jesus, we will never be put to shame. And then remind them that God has taken care of our shame so that he may call us family.